Welcome to the Artsy Raven, a show about writing, publishing, and the arts. With your host, the award-winning writer, editor, and publisher, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of the Artsy Raven, and today our special guest is Kyle Bentley. So Kyle has spent most of his life in Ottawa, Canada, though some of his formative years were spent in the United States. He fell in love with creating fictional worlds and telling stories from a young age, and decided he wanted to be an author while he was in high school. His favorite genres are science fiction, fantasy, horror, and the dark alleyways where the three intertwine. He went to university to study English and psychology to learn how to write better stories and more realistic characters. He's currently working on the Age of Entropy series, a series that blends science fiction, fantasy, and horror with our modern world. The first two books, TheNightmare, Schematic, and The Price of Progress, have been published, and both have won awards from Author Shout. Besides novels, Kyle also writes short stories and material for tabletop role-playing games, which are published by Faceless Publishing, a small publishing house. When he isn't writing, Kyle likes reading, playing games of all kinds, and building models. And he lives with his wife Kelsey in a house that never seems to have enough room for books. So welcome, Kyle.
Oh, hey, thank you for having me on the show.
So it sounded like you wanted to be a writer very early on, and you even pursued it in university.
Yes, I've been telling stories in one way or another to basically since I could talk. My parents talk about when I was very, very small, following them around the house and telling them about all these things that I'd made up. And then during high school, I did some writing through various courses and just kind of on my own. I wrote a novel between high school and university, which hasn't been published yet. It was part of the NaNoWriMo program. And then after that, I decided to really pursue it. And so I've written, as you said, my first two books. I'm working on the third one right now, and I have plans for quite a few more after that.
Okay, now tell us a little bit about Faceless Publishing. Like, how did that company form?
So Faceless Publishing is my personal publishing house. It handles a variety of things. And it started after I wrote my first book and began shopping it around and getting very, very little interest and seeing how difficult the publishing industry has become to get into, where you have multiple stages that you have to go through. You have to find an agent, then you have to find a publisher, then you have to go through the process of making sure the book is actually a good fit. I took a publishing course at Ryerson
Mhm.
after my university degree, and essentially the amount of work you have to do to get a book published through a publisher is very similar to the amount of work you have to do to publish it on your own. And the benefits of going through publishers has gotten smaller and smaller. And
Mhm.
so I decided that rather than risk giving up creative control and ownership of my stories, if I was going to do a similar amount of work, I would handle them on my own. And then by doing that, by starting a company, I've also enabled myself to expand into other areas. So besides just the novels, I've, as you mentioned, published some content for role-playing games. I'm working on a role-playing game of my own right now, which will be at some point in the future. I'll be talking about more. And then also other tabletop hobby areas. So my big project currently has been what's called the War Games Resurrectionist, which is finding lines of miniatures and games that are out of production and bringing them back, either under direct ownership or under license.
Now, I
So,
guess you sell it mostly online, or
yes. So we have digital sales for the most part, although my novels are available in hard copy from Amazon. And I'm looking into how to do distribution apart from Amazon, but right now, because they're print on demand, that's the easiest and most cost-effective way for people to get them.
okay, so you've written novels and short stories and tabletop RPG material. How does writing for games differ from writing fiction?
Well, it's definitely a different beast altogether. I mean, first of all, when you're writing for games, you have to have concern about stats and things like that. You know, everything has to work within whatever game system you're running or you're writing for, and those can be very different depending on the game. You also have to allow for interactivity in a way that you don't when you're writing a novel, because for a novel, it's just a story you're telling. For a game, it has to be a story that people can get into and work through in their own way. And so there have to be options for that. There has to be enough guidance for the person running the game to know what's happening, but also allow them to the flexibility to work with it in their own way if they want to take things in a different direction, if they want to add or increase or decrease challenge. So it is a very different beast, but I enjoy both for the different challenges that they have.
Yeah, like for both game or a fictional story, you're doing a lot of world building. Like, is there anything you enjoy about it?
I really love the world building aspect, and I think that's one of that's kind of where I started off. You know, when I was younger, it was coming up with all these ideas of creatures and technology and places and things, and then that kind of evolved into world building because there needed to be a place to put all those things together. And for me, a big part of world building is making it believable. So for that, I do a lot of research into, history in our own world, into science and tech, into folklore, to try to make something that, even if it's not real, it has that feeling of reality to it.
Hmm. Okay. Now, what was the original inspiration behind your book series, The Age of Entropy?
So it was originally actually a role-playing game campaign, or less a campaign and more kind of a world that some friends and I put together of, all these different characters and strange things happening. And it slowly over time continued to kind of accumulate. And after that world kind of shut down, I guess, and people went on to do different things, I decided that I wanted to actually continue working in that world and telling those stories. And so I decided to write from the point of view of one of the characters in it.
Okay. Now, the series blends science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Like, what attracted you to combining all these genres?
So the best way I can describe the book is what's called weird fiction, which isn't really a term that people use much anymore. It's more from very kind of early on in the modern writing era, where you had writers like Lovecraft who worked with science, horror elements, but things that were fantastical as well, and didn't really try to pin themselves into a specific genre. But nowadays, as I said, like people don't really use that term anymore. And if you read the book, I don't want to go into too much detail that may spoil things, but it's science fiction in that it's about technology, but there's also very clearly some things happening that are beyond our understanding of science. And so that's where the fantasy element comes in. And then, as in a lot of those other inspirations like Lovecraft, where when things get strange and break through what we understand to be possible, then there's obviously a horror element that comes in.
Okay. Do you mind giving us a bit of a synopsis about the first two books?
Sure. So the first book, which is called TheNightmare Schematic, it follows a young man named Connor, who's an inventor. And since he was a child, he's had these horrible nightmares every night of these terrible, impossible machines. But he wakes up in the morning with this knowledge or this certainty, I guess you could say, that he could build them and make them work, even though that shouldn't be possible. And as the book continues, it looks at how this has affected him growing up. It's left him very isolated, it's left him afraid, And where the story really takes off is he decides once and for all, he has to know if he's crazy. And in that case, besides having mental health problems, he doesn't have anything else to worry about. Or if this certainty he has is true, in which case something much stranger is going on. And so the book follows him experimenting with that and then the consequences of what happens when he builds one of these machines.
Oh,
And then the second book, which is called The Price of Progress, takes place 6 months after the first one. And it looks at him both continuing to grow as a person, getting used to talking to people more and kind of coming out of his shell a little bit, but also what happens when he tries to use this machine he's created to help people in what at first seems to be a very simple situation, and then him running headlong into the fact that in the real world, things are usually more complicated than they look. And just trying to do something simple and helpful can have very serious consequences.
okay. Now, what was the biggest challenge in writing this multi-book series?
Honestly, the I think the biggest challenge has just been doing it, sitting down and taking the time. Well, and I'm sure that's what a lot of people say, but there's a balancing act that you have to follow of thinking your work is good enough to that other people are going to want to read it and that you have to, it's worth spending the years in my case, putting it onto paper, cleaning it up, sending it out to people. But you also have to have that um, I don't want to say perfectionism, but that self-critique that tells you that it's not perfect and you can't just throw it out the door once it's finished. You have to actually carefully prune off things that don't work and that kind of thing. So there's constantly that battle of is it good enough? Is it ready? Are people actually going to enjoy it? And yeah, it's a struggle. I know that I had a lot of periods where I wondered if it was really worth finishing just because I didn't think people would be interested. But at the end of the day, I am happy with it. I'm very happy with the how the story is progressing so far with the covers, which I'm very thankful to my editor, I should say my cover editor, who puts those together for me. And yeah, working on book 3 now.
Okay, now where do you usually begin? Is it the world, the characters, or you have the story already?
It's hard to say where this exact starting point is because in this case, it's a character I know very well in a world that's based on our own.
Mm.
So most of the world building is kind of handled already. I don't need to explain to most people what a car and a telephone are. Um, and then the story, I have the overarching story in my head, which will continue for quite a while. So I think it's kind of the point where all those three things meet. And then for me, the big kind of moment when things started to make sense, though, was I guess you could say this starts with the characters because I was reading Stephen King's On Writing,
Mhm.
which is a book I'd highly recommend to any person who wants to try their hand at writing or storytelling just in general. And for me, I'd written a few things before, and it was always a matter of laying out the plot, laying out the characters, making sure everything worked together. And it felt very kind of painstaking and deliberate, I guess is the best way to put it.
Because
But
everything's
then,
planned, yeah.
but then reading On Writing, he essentially talks about how you write the character and then put the character in a situation and see how the character reacts to the situation. And as someone who's played RPGs for decades now, that struck me as exactly what I was doing already. And once I started following that method, things really began to make sense and click into place. And that's where I came to understand when authors say that characters do things that surprise you.
Hmm.
Because yeah, once you understand them enough, they will do things that, make the plot messier, and you have to figure out how to uh how to get around that.
Okay. Now, what's been the biggest reward of running an independent publishing company? Like, imagine it must be challenging.
It is. It's to be honest, it's really just me in the company right now. So
Yeah.
at least I don't have to worry about uh, having other people relying on me to give direction and things. But I would say the biggest reward is just knowing that for the most part I've done a lot of this on my own. Like I said, for the books, I have the covers made by a designer, but I did design the covers myself. I did all the writing. I did most of the substantial editing with some help from some other people. I researched where to publish it. I got it up there. And so being able to look back and say that I did it essentially all on my own is very rewarding. And then for some of the other projects too, like a project where I finished in December, was bringing back a miniatures game, which has been out of production for almost 30 years now. And to look back and think I pretty much did that on my own, it does feel very good. But it comes with challenges too. If I'm not working on something, then it just doesn't get work done.
Hmm.
And because I'm doing most of it on my own, there is a lot of that second guessing of, is something ready? Is it good enough? And are people going to like it?
Hmm. Okay. Now, what advice would you give to authors that are also thinking about self-publishing?
I would suggest to them to do their research, to talk to other people, to read about writing itself as a craft, and just to practice, 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 and to start early.
Hmm.
If they say like the best time to start was 10 years ago, the second best time is right now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I would look into options for self-publishing. Like Amazon has made things. I know a lot of people have issues with Amazon, and I totally understand all those issues. But it has made self-publishing so much easier, and it's removed a lot of the risk
Mhm.
that self-publishing used to have, where you had to do a print run of 400 or 500 books, and if they didn't sell, you just had a massive pile of books and that initial cost.
Yep.
And so with Amazon now, it takes away that monetary risk. So you can really try something without worrying that you're going to essentially bankrupt yourself. My one other thing is a word of caution, which I would say to be very, very careful of who you're working with in terms of things like small presses and publishers and editors and things like that. I personally don't have any bad experiences like that, but I know people who have. A friend of mine who she self-published, I believe, was 2 books, and then found out that her agent and her publisher were actually working together,
Oh.
and they basically made sure that she didn't receive any of the royalties she should have gotten for
Oh
the
my
sales
God. Yeah.
because of the way they had worked out the contract. I've heard of multiple people who have paid a lot of money to agencies to get their book published, and then nothing ever happened with it. I just heard a story recently about someone who had signed up for this group to publish their book. And I don't have all the details, but basically, from some other things that person had been doing, they wanted to withdraw the permission to publish it. And the company basically said, well, you can't do that. We're going to publish it anyway. And then she went to Amazon to ask them to take it down, but because she didn't hold the ISBN
Rights.
number,
Yeah. Yeah.
they basically told her there's nothing she can do. So essentially, her book has been stolen.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I would just advise everyone to be careful, be smart, do your research, talk to people, if you want to go through any kind of a partnership route. And also just for that kind of protection, but also for your own peace of mind, is make backups.
Hmm.
Make backups of your books.
Hmm.
I have a whole folder on my email where when I've finished writing for the night, I email a copy to myself. And that way I know that if my entire computer dies, I still have all my books. But also because all those emails are timestamped, it gives me that evidence of if anyone ever tried to claim something regarding my books, I can say, well, actually, here's the whole chain of me working on it over the course of a few years.
Yeah.
So it's clearly mine.
Okay. All right. Now you're going to do a reading. Can you give us a bit of context and tell us what you're reading, and then you can start reading?
Sure. So I figured I would read part of just the very beginning of my first book, which is The Nightmare Schematic, because it steps into, I think it kind of starts off giving you a feeling of where the book is going, and if that's something that would interest you. It also does break one of the rules that I've had everyone tell me about writing. So I hope that it's evidence that you can break some of the rules if you know what you're doing, despite what people will tell you. The airless cold of the void stretched away from me in all directions. Unimaginably far away, its distant edges were marked by oily, crackling static, like television interference shining through a dead monitor. The chaotic energy roiled at the very limits of my vision, curving to form the inside of the titanic sphere that served as my prison. The void inside the sphere was bigger than the earth, bigger than the universe, bigger even than imagination itself, and yet within it I was alone. No person or creature shared the silent immensity I drifted through, and from which there was no escape. No matter how far I traveled in any direction, the distant seething horizon never seemed to grow any closer. Of course, even if I someday reached the edge, there was no promise of a way out. I could press myself against the crackling barrier only to be vaporized by energies I couldn't comprehend. However, that wasn't what scared me. Compared to being trapped in the void, perhaps annihilation was the better option. No, I feared the barrier because of the creeping suspicion there was something beyond it, something infinitely larger and more terrible. After all, what could be large enough to cage the infinite? The void may not have been populated, but it was far from empty. The airless space was infested with machines. The nightmarish creations drifted aimlessly, forming junkyard constellations and galaxies against the backdrop of static. As the nearest galaxy crept closer, its inescapable gravity began drawing me toward it. As I was pulled inexorably forwards, the endless cloud of metallic glints resolved itself into a sea of machinery. I steeled myself as I drew close enough to see details, wondering what new and familiar horrors I would be confronted with. Each of the approaching devices hung motionless and weightless despite their bulk, their only movement the slow, inevitable drift of the cloud. Each machine had cleanly shattered apart, frozen in an explosion that threw its component parts in every direction. Despite the state of disassembly, I could follow the form and function of each device perfectly. As I grew closer, the terrible details became all too clear. The nearest machine was a wooden box with an intricate series of multifaceted black crystal lenses on one side. Thick cables snaked away from it and attached to a generator filled with strange mirrored armatures. I blinked as the bizarre contraption drifted towards me, and my eyes were flooded with a vision the instant they closed. I saw the machine, assembled and sitting on a table in front of a blank white wall. A man stepped in front of it, and the box emitted a flash of dazzling darkness. The blast threw the man back against the wall, and he disappeared into his shadow, as if falling into black water. He had vanished, but his shadow remained behind, and it slowly turned its head to look at me. A second later, my eyes shot open, and I was back in the void, shivering at what I had just seen. I drifted past the disturbing mechanism and deeper into the cloud, becoming hedged in as other nightmarish machines surrounded me. The next was a familiar grotesquerie designed to skin cats in 9 different ways, all of them cruel. Past that hovered 2 new freakish implements. One was a gun that grafted itself onto the user's arm and grew its ammunition using nutrients drained from its host. The other was a head-sized orb that transmuted all water in a half-mile radius, including that inside living things, into sulfuric acid. Looming above the smaller devices was one I'd named the Slag Driller, a monumental tunneling vehicle that used nuclear fire to burrow through rock faster than anything in existence. Unfortunately, the tunnels it left behind were made unusable by the radioactive blast that lined them. There were countless other devices within the cloud, which was itself only an infinitesimal part of this cosmic madman's junkyard. I wanted nothing more than to leave this awful place behind, but I floated deeper and deeper in. I kept my eyes open as long as I could, but inevitably I had to blink. Each time I did, I was assaulted by images of every machine in front of me as they would look assembled and in operation. The unending riot of awful panoramas sickened me to my core. The visions were silent, so at least I didn't have to listen to the cacophonous symphony of so many scenes at once. I tried to block out the images, to keep myself from committing each one to memory, but they seared themselves into my brain. With each moment in the void, I could feel my sanity abrading, like sandpaper against the base of my mind. With no warning, a shrill electronic wail shattered the unyielding silence. I jolted awake in my bed, heart pounding, breath coming in panicked gasps. Once the adrenaline of waking subsided, I slowly sat up and rested my head in my hands. Every night, I said to the empty room. Every damn night. I couldn't sit in bed and feel sorry for myself forever. Especially today, I reminded myself. Today I meet the new shrink, and I should try to make a good first impression. A look in the mirror reminded me there wasn't much chance of that happening. The face that confronted me was pale and gaunt, with dark bags under the eyes that had long ago become a permanent fixture. The eyes that stared back were pale gray, with barely perceptible yellow-brown flecks scattered throughout. My mom called them gold, but they looked more like rust spots to me. The sunken cheeks were covered in thin stubble from several days without shaving, and the mess of thin light brown hair on top was a month past due to be cut. Unfortunately, the rest of me matched my face. Barely average height, way too skinny, not much to look at, I thought with a sigh. Unfortunately, the stubble was the only thing I could change. So I think that's where I'll stop for now, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.